Okay, now this is one of my favorite slides, and I will tell you why. One of the very common questions I get from my clients when I'm working and helping them to get unstuck from any fear-based reaction they are having, they usually ask me, how do I approach these fears? What do I need to do? And for years, I spent time thinking about how can I translate that beauty and the power of art skills in a way that is accessible to people. So what I'm sharing with you is something that I use it in my work, and I call them the wise moves, which is just another way to refer to exposures. But the caveat here is that when talking about wise moves, each one of the letters is a prompt for you to relate to thinking, to relate to fear in a way that will help you to maximize the exposure you are doing. So let me walk you through that. And of course, if you have any question, please just text it on the chat. I'm just keeping my eye on that. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning in part one is that you can read hundreds of books on art, and every book will have super cool exercises. And if you have a look at social media, there's a lot of posts about different act diffusion skills you can do, or exercises, or metaphors, and that is super cool. But I think act, more than being a technique, is a way of relating to your fears, it's a way of relating to your mind, and it's a way of relating to yourself as the person you want to be. So it's important that when you're holding these principles, you always keep that in mind, that it's not about getting done with exposure. It's about building the skill of stepping back and watching what the mind is doing. So W stands for that, watching what your mind is doing. And there is a difference. If I have a thought, let's say that I am afraid of making a fool of myself with this presentation. There is a difference if I write down on a piece of paper the thought, and I just bring it close to myself and I look at everything from this thought, versus holding the thought on my hands, holding the thought in my lap. Now, because of this context, I cannot do a lot of experiential exercises, right? But notice here that there is a difference between watching my mind from the thought as if it's there, versus learning to have the thought. So when approaching your fears, you may want to check, what am I doing right now? What is, am I just watching my mind? Am I watching the thoughts? Am I watching what's showing up in my head? Or are you consumed by it, taking it as the absolute truth? The I stands for inviting your obsessions. And that sounds a little bit funky, I guess, right? Because therapists were always, or exposure therapists were going to tell you, sit with the obsessions, make room for them, don't fight them. But inviting your obsessions maybe is an easy way for you to remember that your task is to even say, hi, here is the obsession. Here comes my obsession. Here comes my horrifying thoughts. Here come obsessivist abilities, if you are going to be a little bit silly with those obsessions, right? But inviting the obsessions and simply saying that they are coming, saying hi to them, saying, here's my obsession is kicking in. Why this is important? Because when you are acknowledging the obsession by saying it, here is my obsession, here comes this thought, here comes this fear, you're making room for them in a very low-key way. You're actually starting to practice some of the acceptance process that you're going to need to face your fears, right? The S stands for staying with your experience, which, as we know, this is super important in any exposure form, in any exposure model you have been exposed to. Notice that. Clearly, I love the word exposure. Staying with your experience, what I am suggesting here is to describe the sensations that are showing up in your body when you're facing a fear. Saying things like, my heart is beating fast, I'm having this strong urge to run away, I'm having more saliva, I have this urge to blink my eyes so I can neutralize my obsession. Again, staying with your experience is describing what's showing up in your body as it is, right? The moment that your mind tells you, this sucks, this is awful, I don't want to feel this, you are back into you are back into fighting and wrestling with these obsessions. And remember that our task is to make room for them by acknowledging them. So the I inviting your obsessions, you can acknowledge by saying, here comes the obsession, here comes the skills of contamination, here comes horribilis abilis, if you come up with a scientific name for your obsessions. Staying with your experience is describing what's showing up in your body and give that a name with a feeling, right? I am noticing the anxiety, my heart is beating fast, I'm having shortness of breath. When you're doing that, you're helping your brain to recognize what you're going through. And actually, when you do that, it helps your brain to also step back a little bit versus being so consumed trying to solve this problem of what's showing up when you're facing your fears. The letter E stands for either push or away. Why this is important? Because many times when we're facing our fears, sometimes we may go into this backward into mode and just get it done, right? Or even may feel like you're being tortured. But remember that this is a decisional process you're making for yourself to face the things that are important to you. And when you are approaching your exposure exercises, whether that's holding a spider, or talking about spiders with your kids, or cooking vegetables when your kids are around and you're afraid about stabbing them, right? Or going to do a volunteer at a hospital, even though you're afraid about contracting cancer. So when you are doing all types of exposure exercises, it's important to remember that how you handle them will take you either close to be the person you want to be, or it will take you away. So that's something that you can even ask yourself, right? Okay, am I remembering I can make a choice? And then the M starts for making a choice. More than making the right or the perfect choice, my invitation for you is to make the choice as a decision that you are making. And there is not going to be the perfect or the right choice, right? I think again, facing our fears can be really, really hard. In the ideal world, you will always say no to my compulsions, not to my avoidance. But we're humans. And facing our fears sometimes is going to come with some degree of learning to decrease our avoidance crutches. But I will invite you that to keep in mind that as long as you make a decision, that's always a good step, because then you are in charge of how to face these situations. So if it's not ideal certainly, but if you do an avoidance behavior here and there, or when you are facing these fears, more than torturing yourself and criticizing yourself, or maybe telling yourself that you did exposure wrong, I will invite you to remember that you made a choice. And that's the skill that you want to build. That when you are approaching all types of fear situations that are going to pop up in your life, you remember that you have this capacity to choose. It just happens that sometimes we forget that we can choose because we're so consumed with our worries and problem solving and trying to get rid of them, right? So remember that wise moves, each one of these letters is a prompt for you to remind you how you can face your fears when doing exposures. So the E is again, remember that you have a choice, and the M stands for making a choice. And the O stands for observing what comes with the choice. When you are facing your fears and you're making this as an intentional decision you are making, and you are making this as a process to say yes to the yucky stuff that comes when we are facing our fears, see what happens. Quite often, I have seen my clients approaching exposures to get rid of the anxiety, minimize anxiety, to not ever have those obsessions, and to be done. The challenge is that, let me break big news for you here. Wherever we go, there are going to be things that scare us. It's just the nature of being alive. We are wired to experience fear, and it happens that different situations that happen in the world are going to trigger that experience. So this idea of being done with exposures and I'm done with my fears, right? it's not too consistent with how life shows up to us, right? Uh, you can be very successful and very effective overcoming the fear of contamination. But in 10 years, you know, that when you are raising your kids, you may have a different fear. Or when you are changing jobs, you may have a different fear. So wherever we are, as long as we're breathing, there are going to be things that make us be scared. So my invitation is, instead of thinking that this is another thing that you check off, remember that our task is to watch what happens when we are approaching what we are scared. Why this is important? Because you don't want to get hooked on an outcome of having less anxiety, less obsessions, and be done. You want to really develop the muscle of watching what shows up under your skin as it is. Because remember, when we are experiencing emotions, even the most uncomfortable emotions, they usually don't last too long. Emotions are going to last sometimes between 90 seconds to 2 minutes. But what happens that makes an emotion last longer? We're dwelling on the emotion. Why am I feeling this? I shouldn't be feeling this. We're judging the emotion. This is bad. This sucks. Every time we go into this is bad, I don't want to feel this, or we're ruminating, why am I feeling this? That makes the emotion last longer, right? So observing what comes with the choice, say, noticing, okay, I'm noticing that my heart is still beating fast. I noticing that my shoulders are not so tense as they were. I notice my mind is telling me that, okay, this may be okay. So observing what comes with a choice is really describing anything that may showing up in your head, in your body, and with your emotions without any attachment to a particular outcome. Valuing your choice basically means really giving yourself a pat on the back, because you just did one of the most courageous things that we have to do every day, which is facing our fears. The reason why this is important is because in my work and in my life, I know that facing the things I was scared of, it's not easy peasy. It's hard. It's hard work. Sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes we get stuck. I can tell you that I know it's extremely rewarding to face our fears, because amazing things happen our way, and because there is something powerful about being every day the person that we want to be and showing up to others, that the people we love, as we want to show up to them. However, we forget that sometimes when this process of facing our fears is not a perfect process. In fact, it gets messy. It's hard because it gets, we're facing the yuckiest feelings that we can face. So appreciating that and valuing that you just faced one of those fears and that you did your best in the moment, super important. Don't let your mind play tricks in criticizing yourself, in which you didn't do enough exposures, you didn't do exposures right, which for some people sometimes those can be indicators that they are dealing more with meta OCD, obsessions about the obsessions, right? So when facing your fears, valuing your choice means giving yourself a pat on the back. Acknowledge that in that moment you were doing your best, and this is hard work. The next prompt is engaging what is next. Sometimes that I have witnessed many times in my work is that once we approach an exposure, after your therapy or after you're reading a chapter on a book, right? Or after this webinar, you may be spending hours about all the hundreds of exposures you're going to be doing and how you did it and how you even do right this exposure. Remember that you do have a life to live. And within that, exposure is the means towards a values-based life. Exposure is not the end goal, right? We really want to help you to get back into your life and make the best of it while making room for all that annoying stuff that may come up. But there is always life happening next to you. For example, let's say that you are watching a movie with your friends, and then you are just having a fun time. You're having popcorn, you're kind of laughing with the movie, and hopefully you're watching a good movie so you can laugh, because you never know these days. And while you're doing all that, then there is a thought that pops in your mind. You see the image of a naked children. right? And then you follow this. You say, okay, here's my mind coming up with this image. You can say that to yourself. I'm noticing my heart's beating fast. I notice my shoulders just got tense, right? You are staying with experience. You're discovering what you're feeling, and you can do this privately in your head, right? And you're making a choice that maybe you want to engage with what is in front of you with watching the movie, right? See how it goes. Sometimes your mind may come up again with another obsession. No, doing this right? But remember that you don't have to answer to the obsessions that come up, right? If someone texts me right now, let's imagine that your obsessions are like texts coming on my cell phone. I don't have to answer that because I'm more invested right now in this webinar, in this presentation, right? So I may imagine that I'm facing my obsessions as I'm facing the cell phone down, so I cannot see them, right? And then what's next is to do my best to put my attention on the movie. I may actually do an extra effort to notice what's happening in the movie, the colors of the movie, the special effects they are making, right? Or I may decide to have a delicious piece of popcorn, right? And I will just, eat slowly. There is always life happening for us in front of us. My invitation is that after you watch your mind, invite your obsessions, stay with your experience, make a choice, right? Give yourself the freedom to choose, exercise that muscle, watch what comes with the choice, value your choice, engage with what is next, continue moving. Now, I know that is super hard. Usually the feedback I get from my clients is like, by Dr. Zita, my mind keeps coming one after another thought. It's hard. Remember what I'm telling you, that facing our fears is not something to check off from the list and I'm done. It's a process, as in any process requires commitment to keep doing many times over and over. The Dalai Lama doesn't have a perfect practice, a perfect meditation practice. He gets stuck up and down, left and right many times, and he talks about it, right? So just to get a reference that this idea of re-engaging in life with what is next, when your mind is coming up with blah, 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 all types of thought, it's not going to be easy, but it's also not impossible. If you remember to practice these wise moves as prompts, and you practice the skill of refocusing again with what is in front of you, you are going to be building this muscle. And the last letter S stands for soften up with self-compassion. Why this is important? Because I have witnessed hundreds of times with my clients how they actually can get very criticizing and harsh with themselves, right? The challenge is that sometimes because facing their fears is hard, they may not be able to do it. And then they say, oh my gosh, I didn't do my exposure. I'm a bad person. Or if you're dealing with these taboo obsessions like aggressive obsessions, fears about being a pedophile, fears about being a serial murderer, fears about suicide, right? Or metaphysical OCD, or fears about harming others, right? That comes sometimes with a lot of shame, and it's scary. A woman that just delivered her baby, right, that's supposed to be excited about being a mom, and then she has this image and this fear about harming the baby and doesn't want to be with the baby, and is scared about telling the husband about it, is scared about telling the partner about these fears, is scared about telling the doctor. So when doing exposures, all those things show up. The urges to get reassured, the fears about facing these fears, and sometimes the exposure, because it's not easy, may not go as you would hope it will be. That's why being open to what comes is important, but also to remember that beating yourself up is not helpful. Beating yourself up will make it worse because it keeps your brain in a threat mode. And we do want to help the brain to slow down a little bit. So self-compassion will activate the areas of your brain that are soothing, that will help yourself to regroup and keep moving on with your life. So even though it feels like a foreign concept sometimes to be talking about self-compassion, although there is so much literature right now about it, I have found that it's super powerful to add it in the process of facing our fears.